Sunshine, sunshine, where have you gone? Blue sky, I'm holding on for you. I won't let storm clouds get in my way this time, 'cause I know you're mine. And I've got the joy deep down in my heart. I'm waking up with your love from the start. I'm chasing the rainbow through the rain. I know it's gonna be a beautiful day. Yeah, yeah.
Hello, ladies. Welcome back to week 4 of Burdens to Blessings. Have you ever wondered, when is God's timing? When are you supposed to do something? When are you supposed to wait? Today, we're going to look at that and really begin to understand how we can discern what we're supposed to do and when. Come in and join us as we look to the scriptures and find God's answers today.
Sunshine, sunshine, where have you gone?
Okay, ladies, here we are ready to start week 4, so welcome. So, as we enter this next week of seizing God's timing, you've just done your doily activity, right? And you have to stop and think, while a lot of times that activity could bring sadness or regret to a lot of people, God says in His Word that we're to number our days so that it can bring wisdom. And it brings wisdom in that if we really look at it from His perspective, to see that our life really matters. What is it do we really want to gain? What is the legacy that we want to leave? How do we want to take the burdens that we're carrying and see them transformed by God's power into a blessing that really can be a memory that we leave behind? We live it the rest of our life, but it lives on beyond us. So that's what we're talking about today in our lesson of seizing God's timing. I want to tell you about a friend of mine who really, I always think of her when I think of really seizing the moment. Her name was Linda. She's a friend of mine from Georgia, and she was in my Sunday school class for a number of years. And we grew to have quite a relationship. And once I moved to Baltimore, we tried so hard to keep that relationship going. Well, you know how busy life can get, and sometimes we forget to call and keep the contact that we have. And I think that Linda was feeling a little guilty that she hadn't been calling me. Well, I could have been calling her too, but she was taking all that on. And one day she called me. I'd actually been writing. I was writing this chapter and felt so stuck in this chapter. I was trying to really get what God wanted me to say to you all. What was it that He really wanted me to say? And it seemed that as I was trying to prepare it, it just wasn't right. It just didn't seem like the right message. And I would type and I would print and I would throw away. And I'd type and I'd print it, and it just never seemed to be what I felt was God's message for this chapter. And so in my frustration, I decided that I would answer an incoming call, which is something I don't normally do when I'm writing. And I did, and I picked up the phone, I said hello, and in the midst of my work, and I heard this sweet voice of Linda's, "Hey Kim, how are you?" And one of the first things she said to me was, "I'm so sorry I haven't called. I've been meaning to call for the longest time." Isn't that something we say a lot? I've been meaning to call for the longest time. And finally, she said, I was just riding up the road and I just felt like, Linda, call Kim. Call her. Now is the time. And when she said that, honestly, bells and whistles went off in my mind. I knew instantly that the message that I had been preparing for this chapter was totally wrong. And Linda, she had just redirected my mind to where we needed to go. With her words, it brought me to 2 Corinthians 6:2, where God tells us now is the time. Linda had no idea the power that her words were to me. She was just a friend calling another friend. But it was God's timing for her to be able to break through my writer's block to get to me His message. Isn't that a powerful thought? Just a powerful thought that she was able to do that. When I think about Linda's call, the first thing that I remembered was from her own admission, she said, I procrastinated. I have procrastinated. I have been so busy. I really wanted to do this, but I just didn't make the time. And it made me think of that old saying, have you all heard it? If the devil can't make you bad, he'll make you busy. But it still stuck in her mind. So the second thing that I learned from Linda's call was she had no idea really that it was a God thing. She just wanted to call an old friend, a Sunday school teacher, and share some good memories. She didn't hear this powerful voice from God going, call Kim, which so many times we think is the way God speaks to us. It was just a thought. It was just now is the time. You've waited. Now is the time. So she picked up that phone and she called. The third thing that I learned from Linda's call was she said, I feel so bad that I haven't called. And I don't know about you, but something that I feel really bad about is not something I'm real happy to do, right? She had emotions, she had feelings attached to that call. She was thinking, I regret that I haven't called you before. I feel guilty that I haven't called before. So for her to call, what did she have to do? Fight through those emotions, didn't she? The fourth thing that I remembered from her call, it just so happened that her call ended up coming at the perfect time. So that tells me that God knew she was going to procrastinate. God knew that she was going to have to work through some things, but God also knew that she was going to eventually do it. He knew in her heart that she wanted to do what was right, and then it turned out to be just exactly what God would have had her do for herself and for me. Now, what I love, too, about this story is when Linda called me, I received such a blessing hearing from her. When I was able to tell her what her call meant to me and how it had opened up my pathway to writing, she was blessed. And then today, hopefully, you all are being blessed by her story. Isn't that amazing how God works? And so many times we put these limits on God, or we put these expectations on God, like, oh, it has to be something really big to be used, it has to be something really profound to make a difference in someone's lives. And I love the fact that God can take simple phone calls, He can take the simplest things that He asks us to do to really work out God's will or open the door for God's will in someone's life. So if we think about now is the time, what does that mean? Time for what? I want to read to you a passage in Ecclesiastes. It begins in chapter 3. There is a time for everything, a season for every activity under the sun, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. Gosh, I look at all of those emotions and I think that's life. That's what we go through. That's the roller coaster of emotions that we live through. But as I read those, I understand that we never know when that roller coaster of emotion is going to happen. But there are two things that we can be assured of. that no one can ever change. Birth and death. Birth and death. Those are the two things. He starts out, there's a time to be born, a time to die. Those are the two things that we have absolutely no control over. But everything else in these verses, ladies, all the events, all the emotions, the weeping, the crying, the giving, the taking, the loving, the hating, the war and the peace, all these two things that are between our birth and the time that we die, God promises us, He has empowered us to understand, we can accept, and we can seize His timing as these events unfold. That it really isn't chaotic, that it really isn't out of control, that in our lives it's a planned, destined path that we walk, and that along the path that He has empowered us to really step back and understand through His wisdom and to know what to do. I want you to think with me for just a minute. If you were to walk into a cemetery and you look at the grave sites, what are the two dates that you see on the grave markers? The birth, the date they were born, and the moment of death. That's what we see there. But there's also something else there, ladies, that's very important. What is it? The dash. That tiny little dash between the birth date and the day that they departed. That teeny little dash that represents all of that life and all those events that happened through that life. All those events that Ecclesiastes talks to us about. Today, I want to ask you about your life on that dash. What does your life look like on that dash? Are you dancing on your dash? You know, God assures us that He comes to give us not just life, but the abundant life. A life overflowing with joy and His goodness and His peace. To me, that's the dancing. I don't see like, partying, everything's great and everything's wonderful. No, to me, dancing on your dash means being able to be on that dash with His joy and His peace, and to understand what we were talking about before, that He is in control. That, to me, is worthy of dancing more than anything that I can think of. So place yourself on your dash and think to yourself, how am I there? And how am I to seize God's timing to really make that dash really matter for today the way I want it to matter? If you continue in that passage, if you scoot on down a couple of verses, God says, I have made all things beautiful in its time. So many times that scripture is misquoted. It says, most people will say, God will make things all beautiful. But it actually says He has made things beautiful. Remember, He says, come to me, that I am to keep walking, that only in Him can we find anything that's beautiful out of some of the things that we've walked through. And so many times people say, well, how does that happen? I don't know. And you don't know really how God is going to work in each of our events. It's just part of that trust that we must believe that God can do what He says. There are so many things that have happened in your life that you could say are not fair, and it's true. But God says, can you trust me? He's saying, can you get to the point to where not only do you believe in me, but can you believe me? We talked about that last session. Can you believe that I'm able to do what I say that I can do? So much of our belief or unbelief is centered around God's timing, just like in Ecclesiastes that we just read, a time of birth and a time of death and everything in between it. But I've also noticed with God's timing that it requires waiting. It requires waiting. It requires stepping back a little bit and just pondering and wondering what it is that God wants to do. But I assure you, ladies, there's another side to God's timing as well. Sometimes we are lagging behind. It's like, I'm going to wait. I'm going to wait. God, just show me. I'm going to sit here and I'm just going to wait until I just know for sure that it's you. Sometimes that form of procrastination can rob us of some of God's greatest blessings. And what we have to remember is that it's not rebellion. It is just procrastination. It's not that we don't want to do it. We really, really, really want to do it. It's just that we want to wait on God's timing. We want to make sure that it's God's timing. And that can really trip us up, can it? How do we know when it's God's timing? See, Linda's phone call really taught me a lot about the value of seizing God's time and understanding that sometimes it's just about me just stepping out and doing whatever is on my mind and trusting that God knows about the timing, that He knows what's going on. Why not understand whatever the fear is? Maybe it is something as simple as we're afraid that we're going to bother someone. But if they're busy, they won't answer the phone. It's like God's timing, seizing God's timing, going beyond whatever it is that is causing us not to do whatever it is put on our heart and our brain. Pastor James Miller says, we are exhorted to walk with God, but feel oftentimes that God walks very slowly. That's where we are most of the time. Most of the time we're waiting and we're thinking, whenever God is ready, I'm ready. I want us to see and understand that oftentimes it's God who is waiting for us. Oftentimes He is saying, come on, girls, come on, let's do this. So many times we think, why is God not speaking to us? And most of the time it's because we haven't done the last thing that He told us and He invited us to do. So, as we think about God's timing, the question always arises, how do I know? How do I know for sure? What am I supposed to do? When Trey was a little boy, he was so colicky. He struggled. I struggled. He cried all the time. If any of you had a colicky baby, oh, isn't it the worst thing? You feel like the worst mom in the world. Why can I not get this baby to quit crying? So after 3 months of it, I decide I'm going to do something. It's bigger than me, so I decided I'm going to take him to the experts. I'm going to take him to the doctor. So we walk in and I said, Doctor, I don't know what to do with this baby. He's crying all the time. It's been 3 months. Morning, noon, night, and all in between. He will not quit crying. The doctor looked at me in his very expert way and he said, well, that's very simple. Of course I can tell you what's wrong with your child. You're either feeding him too much or you're not feeding him enough. Really? Really? You went to school all those years? And that's the best you have for me? What do you do with that? What do you do with that? How do you figure that out? But I began to think about that and I thought, I know what he's saying to me. He's saying, I need to get to know my child better. I've only been with this child for 3 months. I really need to watch what's going on. I need to listen more carefully. I need to figure out what I can do. I've got to figure this out. It's the relationship. And ladies, that is the answer to how we're going to know when it's God's timing. It's the relationship with Him that we can listen to so that we know what He wants us to do and when He wants us to do it. John 10:27 says, my sheep hear my voice. So when we talk about hearing from God, it is possible. It's not only possible, it's necessary. My sheep hear my voice. There is a practice to being able to understand God's voice. It's so simple when you put it in terms like using your telephone. Think about before we had caller ID. And remember when someone would call you that you talk to most every day, you would automatically recognize their voice, right? But if someone called and you hadn't talked to them in a little bit, you had to listen a little closer. Is this my neighbor? Is this the hospital nurse? It take those people that you don't talk to very often, it took a little bit longer, and sometimes you even had to question, right? It's the same thing with God's voice. The more we talk with Him and then are still to listen to Him, we begin to recognize that voice more immediately. Do you agree with me? It's that relationship that the physician was trying to bring me to about Trey, and it brings us to when we're thinking about what is it that we're supposed to do next, and is this the timing? God's voice. Now, I want to give you 2 or 3 things here that God will never say to you. Number 1, God will never condemn you. So when you hear voices in your mind, you're trying to think, is this God? Could this be? No. Based on Romans 8:1, God will never condemn you. So any condemning thoughts that come into your mind, ladies, that is never God. God will convict us, but He will never condemn us. Number 2, God will never tempt us. God will test us, but He will never tempt us, according to James 1:13. In other words, what I'm saying there is when you eat that first Oreo, it's not God saying, go ahead and eat the rest of the bag. He will not tempt us. 3, God will never lead us to do anything in opposition of what His Word teaches us. He will never lead us to do anything opposite of what His Word says. So there we see how important it is for us to know God's Word, so that we know, or have friends who do, that we can talk to and ask, could this be God? And really be able to go into His Word and really see it, because there's a lot of good things that we could be doing. But we want to do the godly things, right? We want to do what God is telling us to do. Author Henry Blackaby has identified 3 ways that God most often communicates with us. He uses His Word, which is the Bible. He uses His people, which are the believers around you, and He uses circumstances. So these are some ways, ladies, that you can begin to understand and hear and know God's voice, so that when He does speak, you can seize that moment. You can seize that timing, and you can understand, yes, this is God. This is really Him talking to me. And as we began to do that, as we began to understand that He walks with us and He talks with us, we began to understand that everywhere we go, that no matter where we are open to His voice. We know it even in the busiest of places that we go into. His voice will ring true. Have you ever had that? Have you ever had Him speak to you in the craziest places, the noisiest places? It's amazing how His whisper will come through when there's so much chaos around. But that's the power of God in our lives. How valuable He sees us and how significant we are, that He will speak to us and ask us. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that just exciting? It really is. God is calling us to live today, to seize every moment, wherever we go. It may mean, ladies, flashing a smile, doing a happy dance, or sitting and crying with someone. Seizing His moment is capturing that opportunity that God leads us to. I think about my Austin, my youngest child, when he was about 5, 6, something like that. But he loved baseball. And I think at that time it was T-ball. I can't even remember. All I remember is we were in a championship game. And I remember we had 2 outs. The other team, if they could score 1 point, they would tie us, and then we'd have to go into overtime. So it was very important to get this last out. Are you with me? Championship game, last out, last batter up. Ball is hit. With me so far? Okay, well, that ball is hit and it goes up, 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 up. And I'm thinking, gravity has to, it has to catch on one. And then, sure enough, gravity, the ball starts coming down, down, down. And I look and I go, oh my gosh, guess whose glove it's going to? My Austin's. I was ringing the prayer bells right there. So, oh no. And I was watching, and he was like, he had that white hair and that red face, and I saw that glove just dancing around. I'm thinking, oh no, no, no. And he's just going, and then guess what? Bam, ball in the glove. Won the game. Yes. Hardly had any energy in me. Yes. But I go running out on the field and I go, Austin, I am so proud of you. Oh my gosh, you look so calm. How did you do that? And he looked at me and he went, Mommy, I may have looked calm on the outside, but I was shaking on the inside. And I think about that every time I feel God is calling me to something. I think, I am shaking on the inside. But God has called me to be calm in His peace and just go for it. So the lesson that I want you to get from that is, even if you're scared, even if we're scared, let's just do it. Let's just step out and seize God's timing. Hello, ladies. I hope you enjoyed your talk again today. I hope that you are beginning to understand that now is the time. There's so many things that maybe we have procrastinated or waited on for God to do, when He's actually saying, now is the time. I hope that this coming week that you'll let this message, God's Word, really begin to work in your heart, and ask Him, what is it that I'm supposed to do this week? And then whatever you're afraid of, just walk through it. Just keep going. I promise you, it will be so worth the effort. And as you go out into this week, I hope that you'll discover that the blessings are now in whatever it is that God is calling you to do. I'll see you next week.
This is just the